Welcome everybody. Hey, it's time to get started. I am Ron Jacobs, Program Manager on the Windows Workflow Foundation team. And man, I'm super excited that you're here. This is just as great. It's such a cool event that we have people watching from all over the world. So shout out to you guys on the web. Today it's an exciting day because we get to, for the first time, take the wraps off of some of the work that we've been doing in the next release of Windows Workflow Foundation. So we're going to show you a lot of demos and we'll get started. Let me just set the agenda for today. If you don't know much about workflow, and I know all you guys are here because you obviously love and embrace the workflow way, but if you don't, we're going to spend the first 10 minutes, no more than 10. Okay, I'm going to talk about why do some people find workflow interesting? What kind of scenarios is it for? And then we'll get into the really fun part where we'll talk about what's coming in the next version, and we have lots of demos to show you. And we practice them over and over, so I promise they will not blow up, okay? So it's just going to work. And then at the end, we're going to talk about what does this mean for Windows Azure App Fabric, because there's some really cool work that's going on there. And if you saw the keynote, you saw an application that used the workflow, and we're going to show you a different application today and some of the other things we've done in Windows Azure, so we'll spend a little bit more time on that. So let's get started. This is the You Are Here slide. Now, if we think about the world of App Fabric, which I think App Fabric is the new name for middle tier in .NET, okay? If you want to think about it that way, it's the home of all these services, and as we said earlier, it's about on-premise, it's also about in the cloud, and we have a bunch of services that work with it. Now, where is WF in this world? It's in that box right there. In the composite app box, we have WF and WCF. And in fact, when you create an application and into your application, you're really creating a composite app. So though that box looks small, you'll probably spend most of your time there. Now, why? There's 4 reasons we think that workflow is interesting. And we actually had the same 4 reasons at PDC-08 when we first unveiled WF4 to the world. So let's think about the first reason, and that is long-running work. Now, a lot of you build applications that involve these very slow, meticulous, unreliable pieces of communication hardware called humans. And, you know, humans just kind of get around to stuff whenever they get around to it. You never know if they're going to respond or not. You have to deal with timeouts, and there's no good endpoint, no good protocol for them. So then whenever you have humans involved in a process, it's long running. And so we have to have ways of dealing with that. But there's also other examples of this. Like in the keynote, we saw the Pixar RenderMan thing. Now, they didn't use Windows Workflow, but they certainly could have. In fact, I've talked to people who, I don't know, I worked on a system once where we had these big, giant files. And at night, we would start this process, and it was just like a console app, right? We'd start this console app, and then we would go home. And in the morning, we would come in and every now and then there would be some stupid exception would occur, like partway through, and we'd like, oh, you know, and now we got to run the whole process over again tonight. Even if it was at the very last step of this long process, we had to start the whole thing over again. And we thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could sort of checkpoint this process, right? So that as we move through each of the stages, we could checkpoint that so that if it did blow up on the very last thing, all we had to repeat was the last thing. So that would be cool, right? So that's the kind of thing that you could do with long-running work. And then the other thing we found is there's lots of companies who want to give their customers the ability to customize a business process. And in fact, one of the things that we see a lot of people do is to simply take a process. I give you a kind of a basic template, and then you'll come along as my customer and say, well, we do our process a little different. You want to tweak it a little bit. So in Workflow, we've made it possible for you to rehost our Workflow Designer and to put some customized activities together and get this experience. And a lot of customers are doing this. Now, these are customers who use Workflow. Not all of them are doing this rehosted designer thing. But there's many Microsoft products as well that use Workflow, and more all the time. So you can expect to see Workflow showing up in lots of interesting places. Now, I want to highlight one company, which is Aderant. Now, I met these guys when they came through and doing one of our deep dive labs here in Redmond, and they had this need that they wanted to give their customers the ability to customize the product. Now, many years ago, in the 90s, when I was in the ERP and CRM business, we used to just go, yeah, you want to customize it? No problem. Here's the source code. Okay, that's a really bad idea. Don't give out your source code. It's just a terrible idea. Workflow is a much better option for this. And so here's what Aderant did. They gave their customers the ability to customize this process with a bunch of activities. You see their activities there, and then they have this custom design experience that's actually the same designer that you get in Visual Studio rehosted. And so this process here allows you to request time off. So what they did is they built the ability for their users to create a little piece of custom UI, choose what fields you want in the UI and so forth. And then when this process runs and somebody requests time off, a little toast pops up, and the business user who needs to deal with this leave request clicks on the toast. It shows their little app right there in the desktop, and then they click on the task that they are being asked to do. It shows that custom UI, and now the business user can, approve or deny the leave request, right? So that's just a simple example of the kind of things that a lot of companies are wanting to do, and Workflow enables this. And then there's a few other things. One of the things I've noticed, years ago I used to, give these talks about service-oriented architecture. And back in the early days of SOA, everybody was like, ooh, SOA, I got to go SOA, and it was great. Everybody's going to put services everywhere, and WSDL will be flowing out our ears, and it's just going to be awesome. And then somewhere along, I don't know, the mid-2000s, people began to get a little disillusioned with this. They said, this service-oriented thing gets a little complicated. You start moving all the business logic out in all these different services, and you have to coordinate stuff. And it was a lot easier when we just had a web app and a database. That was, much simpler. But in the real world, we have to deal with service-oriented challenges like coordinating lots of calls and asynchronous things. In places where we can't necessarily use transactions, we have to deal with compensation and all kinds of interesting problems. And the other thing that's happening is a lot more people are trying to control things in the real world. We had another group that came through our deep dive labs that was working with scientists who design experiments, lab experiments, right? So you can imagine, like, if you were doing CSI and, kind of gene sequencing or something like that, you'd have this lab with all this heavy-duty equipment in it, and you'd put samples in this thing. So you put a sample in, it has to churn for a couple hours, and then, it transmits a sample over here. And sometimes they have robotic things that move samples around, but other times they have this other kind of device that moves samples around. It's called a grad assistant. And so they give them directions, and they move a sample from this machine to that or whatever. And what they did is they took a rehosted workflow designer, and they allowed the scientist to design their lab experiment, and it would send instructions to the attached hardware through a machine, or send emails to the lab assistant to tell them it's time to move the thing or whatever. So those are the kind of things that you might do. All right, enough said about why Workflow is interesting, because it is very cool. But here's the cool thing. This is a great time to be working on the Workflow team, because this is the time when we get to say, you asked for this, we're going to give it to you. All right, so here it is. Here's the list. You asked for these things. I'm not going to read this list. We're going to show them to you instead. These are all things that were on the top of your list, and I want to show you what we've done to make them possible. So let's come over here to partial trust. Don't forget that. All right, let's come over to my demo machine, and I'm going to show you some interesting stuff. Okay, this is a workflow. How many of you would say, like, that's the first time I've seen WF4? Anybody? Anybody in there? Okay, you're too embarrassed to admit it. That's all right, it's okay. This is Workflow 4. Now, if you look at this activity, you might say, well, gee, I've seen that before. I mean, that looks like something I've seen in .NET 4, right? And what kind of project is this? There's a hint. It says program.cs. Is that a hint? All right. We know this is a C# project. Of course, .NET 4 used VB expressions. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. I have a bug. What the? It says operator can't be applied. Oh, I see what it is. I know what the problem is. I have to use a plus here, because this is a very different kind of expression. This is a really different expression. You get it? All right? Yeah, okay, for those who didn't get that, it says enter a C# expression. All right, so for the longest time, whenever I showed workflow, and I would show a C# project, and then it would say enter a VB expression, and people would go, huh? Okay, so now, if you're a VB developer and you create a VB project, you get to use VB expressions. If you're a C# developer and you do a C# project, you get to use C# expressions. It's just the way the world should be, all right? Okay, so now the next thing I wanted to think about was our friend the state machine. And so I sent out a tweet, and I asked the people on my Twitter follower list if they had any ideas of what I should demo for a state machine. And I promised I would give credit to the person who gave me the idea. So Richard Blewett, this is for you. All right, so imagine we've got a mobile phone here, right? Now, you cannot implement your mobile phone software with Windows Workflow Foundation unless you have a mobile phone OS that runs the full .NET framework. Okay, I just want to say that up front. But this is just an example. So let's imagine we were going to implement a mobile phone with Workflow. So one of the things we could do is a state machine. Now, we wanted to have state machines in .NET 4. It didn't quite make the timeline, okay? And so we have a CTP available on CodePlex today with full source if you want to work with a state machine in WF4. We're continuing to enhance this and work on it for .NET 4. So state machines are great when you have an environment where the workflow is really conditioned by external events. So like a regular sequence sort of drives and controls the flow, but sometimes you have to respond to things that happen in the outside world. So let's say in my phone, the first thing happens is we turn it on, right? And then we come to some kind of state. I'm just going to call this the ready state, all right, because it's ready. It's ready to do something. And now in the state machine, if I double-click this, I have a couple of options. I might want to do some things when we enter the ready state. And so I imagined, I don't know, I've never written a mobile phone OS, but it seemed to me, I might have to let the telco network know that I am here and I'm ready. Okay, so I might say something like, tell network, I'm ready. Okay, and so I can drop a little activity that knows how to tell the network I'm ready. All right, that makes sense. And so let's build our solution here. Oh, jeez, another bug. Oh, my gosh. OK, so it's telling me that my state machine must have at least one transition. Now, I know this doesn't surprise you that a program that's in an invalid state would actually cause the build to break. You would think that's just like the way things ought to be. Actually, in WF4, we happily let you build your solution with your workflow in an invalid state. OK, so we're making the world right. It should break. It does break. Okay, so now, in fact, if I even close that and I just double-click it, we will happily load up the state machine and tell you what to do. All right, so we need a transition. So obviously, we could turn the thing on. Let's add a transition where we could turn it off. All right, so the way this works is you drag a state out there and you drop an arrow on it, if you do it right. You see, it's kind of tricky. There we go. All right. So now that's my transition. And in fact, I'm going to give this transition a name. We'll call it power off. Now, when there's a transition, there's something that triggers the transition, something from the outside world, something we could detect in the workflow. And so I have some activities I've defined that allow me to think about it. Now, as I thought about what would cause us to power off, it seemed to me that there was at least two things. One thing would be, maybe the user pushed the power off command. So I'm going to drop that in a parallel. And the other is a low battery notification. So maybe the hardware signaled us that the battery's low, we're going to shut off. All right, so I put these in a parallel because we could respond to either one of those conditions. And then when this transition happens, there might be some other action I want to take. So I could have a condition on this. It's optional. But let's say, imagine I've got a thing called device status, and I say, oh, okay, if we have a call in progress, then we're going to use the drop call command. I think my phone has one of those. It's great. So all we have to do now is drop the call. We're good to go. Okay, so that's pretty cool. But, I was thinking about maybe there's some other conditions that we might need to think about here. I'm not sure what all they would be, but I want to leave a note for my team. So, how could I do that? Well, actually, there's this new thing here where I can add an annotation. So I can say, to do, are there other conditions that cause this? All right, so I can leave a little note for my team. So this will get added to the XAML. It will stay with it. And if I mouse over, I can see the little to-do thing here. That's kind of cool. And if I want to really be annoying, I can pin it in place so you can't ignore it. All right, so there you go. So now annotations are available there as well. Now, when we think about the phone, there's some other states that we probably would get into. Like one of them might be, I just like to drag them all out here and think about them. So let's say one of these states would be talk, right? Because you're talking on the phone. And of course, there's sort of two ways that you would get to talk. One is that you dial something, and the other is maybe that the phone was ringing, okay, and you answered it. So I got these states here. Now, one of the cool things we've done here is if I drag this state over here, I can just drop it on that arrow, bam, okay. It just does what you would expect, the way the world should be. And in fact, if I go, well, actually, between ready and talk, there's dial, right? So I forgot to put that in here. Let's just drag that over here and drop it on the line. Oh, that's much better. Okay, and then ring. Okay, obviously, well, ring will come after out of ready, so I can just drop that right there and move it down here. And then talk connects up to ring, so I can just, yeah, that gets a little weird. But okay, you get the idea. All right, that we got this nice little thing where we automatically connect arrows and insert things. You're not surprised, right? It's just the way it should be. All right, okay, great, I'll take it. All right, so this will take all day if I keep showing them this way. Let's take a look at a completed one here. We can look at a couple more things. So here's a more completed diagram. And actually, let me close this. And let's just look. If I open this project and I said, I wonder what there's left to do on this thing. If I just bring up the search box here and say to do, you see we found in the file some things. And we found in the XAML, some to-dos, okay? So we're kind of used to, if I double-click on the XAML, it's going to pop me into a XAML and an XML editor and all this. It's not really what I want, right? So if I double-click this here, oh, it takes me right into the designer to the right place, just like you would expect, okay? So that's pretty cool. And then if I hit F3 to search again, so it's found it in this property, and then I hit F3 again, it takes me to another spot in the diagram that's buried way down deep, right? Because I know what happens, right? You go, I know somewhere in these many levels of diagrams, I used a variable and I can't remember where it is, right? We've all been there. And then you have to open it in XAML view and then look at the XML and try to figure out where it is. Okay, so now we're just doing, again, the way the world should be, what you would expect, right? That this is how the team, by the way, I have to give a shout out to our ADX team, the designer team in Shanghai. Awesome work. Thank you very much. All right. Yes, let's give them, good job, guys. We all need you. All right, so now let's take a look at something else that's new. Let's see, where is it? Oh, here it is. So I had this idea, for marketing, kind of social marketing. That's kind of the big thing now. Everybody wants to have, businesses want to have Facebook and Twitter and kind of connect with customers. Like, I really want to hear what my car company thinks about, so I want to subscribe to their tweet. I really want to hear this. And so anyway, we're working on some ideas for this, so maybe you want to do this. I have a little database in here, and I've got a table with targets. That's what we call them in marketing terms. They're targets. And so, you know, there's places out on the web where you can buy this kind of information, you know, so you get people's names and Twitter and email and their Facebook and tags and stuff. And so I created a little database. Now, in order to use this in a workflow, I obviously need to go get these records out of the database. So we have some new activities here. Here's the data activities. And one of the things I will want to do is just go read this list of customers out of the database. Now, Workflow 4, I would have had to create my own activity, kind of a code activity or something to do this, but we made it easy to do this now. I have an activity here called execute SQL query of T. All right, so I just set up my connection string here with what database I want, right? And then I set up my SQL command. So here's the select, you know, and all the things, just like you would expect, right? Just real easy. I can call stored procedures if I want to. I can set up parameters for my SQL. In this case, I don't need any. All right? And then down here, what I'm going to do is go through the result set, and just for each record, I'm going to convert it into a customer. So what I did is I knew up a customer, and then I have this new activity called multi-assign, because I have to set up all the fields of this thing, and why should I keep dropping, you know, 5 different assigns and, you know, all separate? So multi-assign is just a nice convenience where I can come in here and set up for each thing in the record, you know, what I want. All right, so that allows me to map this whole thing, and the return of this, if you look over here in the properties window, let me zoom in here, the result is a thing called targets, all right? So what I've declared here is a variable. It's a list of customer. All right? So I just go into the database, select all the rows, I get back a list of customer in this targets variable. Cool. Now the next thing I want to do with my targets is I want to actually hit them with some great marketing information. Some offers I'm sure they're going to approve of. And so since I've got a collection of these guys and I'm going to be doing I/O, it just makes sense that I would be as efficient as possible, do a lot of async I/O, right? So if I use parallel for each, what will happen is we'll start lots of async I/O operations, and we'll be as efficient as possible, get through them as quickly as possible. And so we'll do this for each customer in the list. And then if I drill into this, we'll see once, even inside of that parallel, I'm going to do another parallel. So what we'll do is we'll write to the console what we're doing. Then we're going to send an email. We'll post to their Twitter, and we'll post to Facebook. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Now, a lot of you have written little activities to send email. I know I have, right? And so, but actually, we have now a nice new send mail activity. So here's the send mail activity, and it treats addresses as a collection, right? So what I'm going to do is add the email of this particular individual to the collection. And then in the mail, I can set up, you know, to and CC and the subject. I'm using an HTML message body, so I'm just going to use a string resource to get the marketing mail in there, but you could type text if you wanted to. You can add attachments and all sorts of goodies there, right? So, and then I'll update the console with what we sent there. Now, for Twitter, you know, when I first started talking about REST, I used to always show Twitter demos, and so I've written lots of Twitter demos in the past, and it was really easy to write Twitter demos in the past. Then the other day when I went to write this demo, I found that they got all into this security thing, and you know, you have to do OAuth and everything, and anyway, it got way complicated, so we're going to fake it, all right? And so there's a new activity here, an HTTP post activity. In fact, we have a bunch of client activities for HTTP, get, put, post, and delete. So the post activity just allows me to say, here's my URI, and the template we're going to address in there, and then you can add parameters if you want to plug them into the URI template. All right? And then in the content, I can just put it whatever I want to post to this thing. I'm just going to post some text, the first name and the last name. All right? And I have a little console app that is using WCF Web HTTP that will just echo those to the screen since we're faking Twitter. And I didn't even bother to fake Facebook. I mean, you know, we're not even going to bother with that. Just, yeah, we're fine. All right. So then, after we've sent all this lovely communication to random people, we will wait for 2 hours and do it all over again. All right, so that's how our little flow chart just flows right on back. So let's run this. Okay, so here's two windows. This one is where our flow chart will run. This is the HTTP service that's listening for those posts. And surprise, yep, we're sending, and we did the HTTP posts. And you see how we did those all async? So first we did all the marketing rights. That was the first thing in the parallel. Then we sent the emails, but all the marketing rights happened before the emails actually happened, right? Because that was all async IO. That's why they showed up out of order. And there's the posts. All right, so that's very impressive, right? Well, you're really going to love my skills with email, because this is where it gets cool. All right, so there's the nice marketing email. And in fact, I'm thinking, you know, if this whole workflow team thing doesn't work out, I've got a definite future in the spam business. All right, so, okay. All right, so that's it for the demos of that part. We're going to have more demos later. So some things on the Workflow Designer. Okay, so workflow services. One of the things we heard over and over again is, I have an interface. I have the iMyService interface. Can I implement that with a workflow service? And we said, sure. All you have to do is write it yourself. You just drop lots of activities and set it up this way, and then you can do it. In fact, I even have a blog post on this. So I'm like, what's wrong with you people? Just read the blog. You can do it. All right, but that wasn't enough. It's okay. We heard you. And in fact, we totally agree. You should be able to point at an interface and get it to do what you want with a workflow service. So we're supporting contract first. All right, so let's take a look at that. So I have actually, I can drive that from here. Here I have an assembly here, expense.contracts, and in my contracts assembly, I have this type, expense item, and I have my service here with really big font, so you can all see it. It's an iExpense service. It has two operations, submit and approve. Okay? So one question we often get is, you know, should I implement my service just with WCF, or should I implement it as a workflow service? And for those of you who are wondering, a workflow service is simply a service, a service that implemented the business logic with workflow activities. So here's a case where there's clearly an ordering issue, right? I mean, you have to submit the expense before we can approve it, right? And so if I implement this with WCF, it's not that hard to do, but I would have to have a little bit of logic that if you called approve before submit, I would have to throw you an error, like I can't approve something that hasn't been submitted yet, right? But it turns out that a workflow service makes this much easier to deal with. Now, obviously, I want to be able to implement this contract as a workflow service. So if I come back over here to my empty workflow service, here's what we're doing. If I right-click here on the project and I say import service contract, now it says, okay, where's your contract? What type has it? And there's my iExpense service. So I select that. And you notice that we've generated over here a couple of activities that show up in the project. So this is early prototype code, so this experience might change a little bit between now and shipping. But you see here now I've got iExpense service in my toolbox. And so now I can just say, all right, well, this is a workflow service. The first thing you do is submit. Then the second thing you do is approve. If I can land that in there. All right. So let's close that. So now you get your operations in order. And you know, from here, you would have to deal with, oh, see, I dropped approve in the wrong place. Let's cut that. Actually, I can just drag it out of there. There we go. All right, so now you've got your orders in place, and now all you would have to do is set up whatever correlation or use context binding or whatever to control the ordering. But one of the things that people found tricky about this is this whole thing where the content definition is. And we were always being asked, well, should I use message or parameters? Well, it turns out if you want your workflow service to look like it's implementing a contract, you should use parameters. So we put it in the parameter. And that one's not hard, but it's really the response this name here, submit expense result, is a very specific name. That's the name that WCF would give the result message. And so, you know, like I said, I put up a blog post and a video where I explain how you do this yourself, but it's just nice not to have to do it yourself. And again, it's the way the world ought to be. All right. So now we're going to talk about one of the other issues. You know, I put up this poll on this website where I asked people what they wanted to see on our podcast show, Endpoint TV. And so a lot of people put ideas and voted about things they wanted. And the number 2 issue, right after how do you do OAuth with WCF, the number 2 issue was how do I version workflows? And this was a hard problem. There was some things that were just really difficult about this. So we're doing some things in the next release to fix this problem. And there's 2 parts to it. The first part is we're giving you this concept of a workflow identity. And so I'm going to have Leon come out and join me. Leon, why don't you come out and get this demo ready while I talk about this. Leon Wieliki here is a program manager on the workflow team. And he's been working on these features. So the first concept we're going to introduce is this workflow identity concept, which just allows you to associate a name and a version to a workflow definition. And then whenever we persist it, we're going to store the identity along with the instance data. And then we can detect mismatches at load time. Then there's a second part, which is dynamic update, which is really about how do we update the instance data so that it will work with the new definition. Okay, and so there's 2 parts of this process. One part is we make some changes with the kind of change tracking mode, and so we get an update map, and then later we come along and apply this update map to your instances. So let me explain the history here so you can all follow. In WF 3.5, we used to persist the definition and the instance data in the instance store. Now, this gave us the possibility that you could use dynamic update and change just one instance. And you could change its definition kind of in one place, which was cool, but it had a downside. And the downside was that whenever you persisted a lot of stuff, right? And every instance had its definition stored with it. So a lot of the feedback for WF4 was, can you make persistence faster? So we said, great, not a problem. We'll make it faster. We will just not persist the workflow definition. That's one part of making it faster, and we did a bunch of other work as well. And this is great. It's way better. Until somebody comes along and changes your workflow definition to workflow v2, and then you go to load your instance data, but we don't know what version it is. And then what happens? Kaboom! You get an exception. And what's really difficult about this is that the exception you get is somewhat unpredictable. It's not even the same exception every time. So depending on the kind of change you make, you might get different exceptions. So it's really hard to deal with this problem. So here's what we did. We stamp your workflow with an identity. Actually, you do this. You're the guy that writes the hosting code for your workflow. So you give it a version, and you say, this is my workflow version 1. And then when we persist your workflow, we stamp your instance data with the same version information, and we store it in the instance store. Ooh, that's very bad. That is really, you ever hit the end key when you didn't want to? That is really bad. Sorry. All right. Now we've persisted your instance in the store with a version. Now what happens is somebody comes along and changes the workflow version to version 2, and now we can detect. We say, aha, you have version 2, but we're trying to load version 1. And now we got a choice to make. Now, if you could detect this before you try to load it, you could actually say, make a decision. Maybe you want to allow version 1 to complete. So you could go grab version 1 definition and run that. Or you could say, nah, I'm just going to let this blow up. But now you get a better exception. It's a version mismatch exception. All right, so, and if you wanted to, now you could react to that. So Leon, let's take a look at this. And you're on number 4, right?
Right.
Here we go. All right. So Leon has written a little application here, a simple app, and it has this nice, simple activity here. You see kind of a hello world, right, where we say, what is your name? And then we're going to have a read line, and then we'll say hello to your name. Now, Leon taught me in our Activities Best Practices video series on Endpoint TV that readline, readline should not actually call console.readline. It should actually set a bookmark because workflow activities should never block the thread, right? So it sets a bookmark which says, I don't have the data I need, but the host application is going to get it for me. So when we call readline, our application will go idle, our workflow rather, will go idle, and then the host application will do the console.readline, and then we'll come back. Now, Leon, this activity looks totally fine to me. I don't understand why we had to version this.
Well, if you don't input any name, you will say hello to nobody.
Oh, yeah, okay. So saying hello to nobody is kind of lame. All right, let's look at version 2 of our activity. All right, so in version 2, we've enhanced it to have a little special error handling code here. So we'll say, if you pass us a null or empty name, then we're going to give you an error message, all right? And the error message will just say, please enter name. Otherwise, we'll say hello to your name, all right? So that's our V2 behavior. Okay, so let's go ahead to the program here, and we have set up this program to show you what it's like to run without identity and then what it's like to run with it. So now we're going to run it without identity support. Okay, so let's run this. We've got some breakpoints, and we'll show you the behavior as it goes. So here you see some code where we're going to new up a workflow application and pass in the activity definition that we're using. And this is just like you would do in WF4. All right, so let's hit F5 to continue. Now, our host application here has started it. The workflow did the write line. And then when it hit the read line activity, it set a bookmark, and it persisted and unloaded and all that. Now the host application is here doing the console read line. All right, so Leon, let's see what happens if we enter a blank name here. All right, so we have reloaded the instance, and now we're breaking into the second part of our host. And so what we're doing here is we're, again, newing up a workflow application, but this time we're passing activity 2, which is the version 2 of our activity. All right, so let's hit F5 and see what happens. Yikes. Leon, that is a really lame exception message.
Sorry for that.
Yeah, what is up with that? It says activity 2 has to implement activity 1. I don't get that. Okay.
Actually, the cause of this exception
Yeah.
is that this exception is due to a version mismatch. So you started with one definition,
Yeah.
persisted,
Yeah.
and when you load it, you try to continue with a different definition.
Okay, so this confuses the workflow runtime because the instance state is storing an instruction pointer, so it knew what it was expecting, but when it got this different definition, you know, things went bad. Leon, can we do better than this?
Yeah, of course we can.
Oh, okay. All right. Let's see it better. So we're going to turn on the identity support, and then we'll see how this will work in the next version of workflow. So let's go ahead and run it. And once again, we'll see that we broke here, but now we have a new type called workflow identity. And so we pass in the name that we want to associate with this. That can be any arbitrary string you want, and a CLR version. So we're stamping this identity with version 1, and then the next line shows workflow application where we new up our activity and we pass in identity v1. So we're saying workflow application, this definition, we're going to call it identity v1, that one, all right? So go ahead and hit F5. And now we have created our instance with an identity. Once again, let's hit enter here and see what happens.
Done.
All right, so now we're to the second part. We're newing up an identity as we did before, only this time with version 2. Again, we load up activity 2 with identity version 2. Let's continue and see what happens. Now we get an exception, but it's a better exception, right? It's a version mismatch. And we know very specifically what went wrong. We were looking for version 2, but we found version 1 in the instance store. And the exception has these fields, so we could, if we wanted to, go back and try to reload with a different definition. But Leon, you know, I don't really like to write code that reacts to exceptions. I'd rather avoid exceptions in the first place. Can we do that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, all right. So we're going to make some changes here to the code to show how we do that. And so what we have done is we've added a new type called Workflow Application Instance. And what this type does is it gives me a way to say, I want to go in the instance store and not really load an instance, but just find out what version it is. Okay? And then once I've found out, then I can come back and make a decision about what I want to do. So let's say here in our sample, we have a dictionary of definitions that's keyed by the identity. So now we're going to say, well, if we found version 1, then let's get the version 1 definition and just run it. If we found version 2, we'll run version 2. All right? So Leon, let's run it like that and see what happens. OK, so here we are once again. We've started our host. Let's enter a blank name. And now you see that we got the version 1 behavior where we said hello to nobody. Right? But that's what we wanted, right? Because this instance started under version 1. It's now going to complete under version 1, which is the behavior that we wanted here in this case. All right, Leon, so that's great. All right, so that's pretty cool. But there may be cases, though, where you think, maybe we can't let a workflow complete under version 1. I mean, it depends on why we made version 2. Maybe there was a bug in version 1, and we said, we can't let anything finish under version 1 because there's a bug. We can't do that. Or there might be a case where the business rules have changed, and so anything that started under version 1 now has to change to version 2. And that's where dynamic update comes in. So the process of dynamic update is really, it goes like this. If I thought about how do I get from version 1 to version 2? If we thought of this like a journey, we're making some changes in our workflow, we could actually describe them like it's a map that tells you how do we get from version 1 to version 2. You know, we added some activities, changed some expressions, added some variables or whatever. So then we can save this map, and then later we could come along to persisted instances, and we can choose which ones we want to do this to. We can then go and apply the map and migrate the persisted instance from version 1 to version 2. All right? So, Leon, I heard about Contoso Mortgage. And it turns out these guys, let's go to your machine. These guys were making serious money. 2 or 3 years ago, the mortgage business was great. They were really doing really well. And Contoso had this very interesting loan process. And in fact, you see it here on the screen. We might need to zoom that in, Leon, so people can see the whole thing, right? Yeah, even bigger. Go bigger. Go like, yeah. Now, really big, dude. Really big. Like, I'll do it. I'll do it over here. There we go. There we go.
Go for it.
All right. So the first part is they simply wait for the customer to submit some loan, a mortgage application, all right? So they submit it, and then along the mortgage workflow here requests an appraisal. So we send out some email to the army of Contoso appraisers, who then go out and invent some number out of thin air. Just dream something up, doesn't matter. And then they come back and they enter the appraised value in the tool. And after the appraised value is entered, we process the appraisal. And then the single most important step for Contoso Mortgage, verify that they can sell this loan, right? Because once you sell it, who cares if the guy pays for it or not? It doesn't matter, right? So then we fund the loan if it can be sold, and that's how the process works. Now, Leon, I understand that while this was making lots of money recently, though, the bank regulators came and visited. They weren't too happy about this.
Yeah, they weren't too happy with the verify loan can be sold step.
Oh, OK. So they want us to make some changes. All right. So Leon has created a nice tool. It's a sample. This is just some early sample code that you can look at and see. But first, before we look at that, let's run a loan through our system and see how it worked. All right, so we've got here some customer data. We just entered, here's somebody with a gross income of $6. I think they'll qualify, though. Let's start the approval. And so we're going to, their loan is in the system now. It's been persisted. OK, so we're going to enter an appraised value. Leon, I am sure that house will sell for $500,000. I mean, if not today, surely within 6 months. All right, so click submit. And yeah, you see the loan was approved because it can be sold, and that's really all that matters. Okay, but now we have to change the process. So you've written a nice little tool here, and it's just a sample tool that shows what kind of thing could be done. All right, so we are loading up our workflow, and we see that it has a version number in it. Let's change that to version 2. And then, now it's the verify loan can be sold. That's the one they didn't like, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay, so let's delete that. And then we have a new activity that says verify income and assets. So they actually want us to verify things. You know, what can you say? All right, so we're going to enter some information here. And while Leon's entering that, you'll notice that we've taken advantage of some improvements in the Workflow Designer that allows us to easily draw adornments on the shapes that we're changing. And then we're keeping a log of the changes that we made in this editing session. So that way we can create our update map. So Leon, let's create the update map. And so when we create this map, our tool is actually going to create both an update map and the new version of the workflow, which is deployed in our system. Okay, so Leon, now we've got these running workflow instances that were started under the old process. And the bank regulators say we now have to do the new process, right? So let's go to the other tool. So this is another tool that Leon has created, just a sample. It's just an idea of what we might do. So if we refresh the instances here, we'll see the instances in our store. We see they're all version 1 instances. So we'll select those, and let's apply the update map. So we simply went through each of those instances. We loaded it up, passing in the update map. And then the runtime does whatever modifications are necessary to store it back in the new version. And so now they've all been upgraded to the new version. All right, Leon, let's go look at the process now. Let's enter some appraisal value here. All right, so I guess now we have to be a little more honest about the appraisal. Yeah, so let's put in $100 bucks. All right, yeah, houses have gone way down. All right, so $100, we see that, okay, this loan was now rejected because the income or assets were not sufficient. All right, so that's just kind of a silly example, but we've shown you how we could start a workflow under one process. We can update the definition. We can then go to the instance store, migrate persisted instances to the new version, and you know, these kind of little tools that we saw here are sort of samples of the kind of things that you might do and build it eventually. Thank you very much, Leon.
You bet, Ron.
Give him a big hand, would you? All right. Okay, so that's exciting stuff, and that's kind of the cool things we're doing in WF4, the next release of .NET. Whew, almost said something I shouldn't say there. All right, now let's talk about Windows Azure App Fabric. There's a lot of excitement around this, and I think it's important to say that we are, as the saying goes, we are all in on this baby, all right? We want to make WF work exceptionally well in Windows Azure and Windows Azure App Fabric. Now, one thing you should know is that this is not like, we're not blowing the whole thing up and reinventing anything. None of that. Okay, none of that. This is a natural evolution. It's the same programming model. It's the same runtime. There's going to be some new activities and runtime enhancements to support the cloud. How many of you have written an app for Windows Azure? Okay? All right, all you guys with your hands up, you know that when you write an app for Windows Azure, there's some things you do differently, right? There's just some things that you need to do differently because you're in an environment that's written for massive horizontal scale. And likewise, when you write workflows that run in Windows Azure, there's some things you'll do differently. And really, as we get closer to shipping this, we're going to have a lot more details about what those differences are. I thought about trying to explain it, but there's no way I would have time. All right, so let me just say that we think the cloud is great for workflow. Because of this, this pre-packaged, pre-configured environment, just bam, it shows up, you drop your workflow in, and you get massive scale, everything's configured, everything's managed, and you can take advantage of all those App Fabric services. And then, really, we think workflow is exceptionally good for the cloud. Because in the cloud, you have all these moving parts, lots of services, lots of async things happening, queues and whatnot, a lot of coordination work that needs to be done. And workflow is very good for that. And at least at this point, the cloud doesn't have transactions. And so you need a model for doing consistency without distributed transactions, right? So we think there's a lot of goodness there. Now I'm going to bring out Vikram from the Windows Azure App Fabric team. And Vikram, we're going to talk about, hang on just a second here. This is the Contoso auction app that we saw in Karan's session. And this app is really cool. It's an auction app that features a workflow service. Not a workflow service. It's a workflow, the checkout service that's running as a workflow in Azure App Fabric. So this is the thing we're going to look at now. All right, so go ahead and switch over to your machine there. Now, the first thing you'll notice as we're looking at a workflow that's meant for Azure App Fabric is it looks a lot like any workflow that we've shown today. And really, that's the way it should be. It shouldn't be radically different. It should be just really the same thing that you've learned and you've been investing your skills in and building activities for. And so in this particular scenario, when we're doing the checkout service, we have to receive a message in, check the inventory, and then decide if we can fulfill the order and whatnot. The details of this are a little bit less important. What I want to show you, though, is the application designer. This is really cool. So what you'll do is as you build out your application in Azure App Fabric, you'll be drawing these boxes and connecting your things to the services that they need, whether it's SQL Azure or the cache service or the message bus. All these things will be connectable from your workflow. And so once we've done that, then we can treat our application as a single unit. So we can deploy it to the cloud, we can manage it as a unit, and manage it by policy. So Vikram, let's look at that management experience, because it's really cool. So here we see the Azure platform, and we see our app running in the cloud. And you can see all the parts of it that are going on, along with some metrics. And in fact, we have some metrics for the workflow as well. So if we drill into that workflow, we get a very interesting view. So it's showing us the workflow here, along with some metrics that tells us what, the health of the activity. So if we're getting failures in particular activities, that might indicate some need to do some troubleshooting. We have that kind of information here as well. So all this monitoring and things that we've come to know and love about Windows Server App Fabric now becomes quite easily accessible in Windows Azure App Fabric as well. So thank you very much, Vikram. All right, give him a hand. Vikram. All right, cool. So that's just a really brief look at some of the things we're doing with Azure App Fabric. As you might have seen in Karan's talk yesterday, this stuff is really early, man. We're coming out first half of 2011. We'll have CTPs of that sort of thing coming. The other stuff that I showed you, these enhancements to workflow and the designers and the new activities, are coming at some later point, and that's all I'm authorized to say. Okay, some later point. All right, so here's the thing. We want you to talk to us. We want to hear from you. You guys have been telling us what you wanted. We're trying to deliver as much as we can. We now have we have the whole social media thing as well. We got Facebook/@Fabric. We've got Twitter @@Fabric, or you can tweet me at Ron L. Jacobs. We also have an email, appfabric@microsoft.com. So we want to hear from you. In fact, we have a wall at the end of the hallway. I call it our customer wall. So if you want to send me like an architectural diagram about your thing and how you use workflow, and you want to send me the requirements you have for your workflow thing, and I'll put them up on our customer wall, because I want every developer, every tester, every program manager who walks by that thing to think about you every day, what you need, what you're doing, because that's why we're here. All right, so talk to us and let us know what you're doing. And then we have podcasts. Of course, we have Endpoint TV that you should be watching as much as possible and downloading and telling all your friends. And then we have a new thing we're going to start, which is App Fabric Radio. So if you like to, go jogging like I do or something, it's hard to watch, a video while you're jogging. It's very dangerous, too. So maybe you might like to have an audio podcast. So I thought we're going to try this. We'll see how it works. And the idea is that you'll be able to submit your questions on email, Twitter, or Facebook, and we'll just have some of us on the team sitting there in my office with microphones, and we'll gather around and we'll talk about stuff. If you ask us questions, we'll try to answer. We might not be able to, and we'll just do our best to try to get to as much as we can, because again, we want to have a dialogue with you so that we can deliver the things that you need out of us. All right, so bottom line, I think everybody should invest in workflows today. There's no need to wait for tomorrow. It just gets better. Yeah, there's some rough edges around today. These things are getting better. We have lots of great resources to help you get started. Hands-on labs and things we've created that makes it real easy. Lots of endpoint TV episodes that will help you. The blogs and so forth. So I encourage you to connect with us there. And now, I have exactly 4 minutes for questions. Who has a question for me? Yes, over here.
Do you have attributes that you can get that logging automatically instead of putting right into the console all over the place? I found that I really wanted to know every activity that ran, and it just seems to me that I ought to be able to set that global.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm sorry. You got microphones, don't you? So the question was, is there a way, like those little messages that we wrote out on the console, is there a way we could have those appear somewhat automatically? No, not really. I mean, we have the workflow runtime emits a lot of tracking events, right? And so you can set up a tracking participant, and then you can spew out messages all day long. But we're going to leave that up to you, because the workflow runtime runs in lots of different environments, not necessarily a console. It'd be hard to generalize where are we going to write to, and if we're in ASP.NET or WPF app or whatever. It's hard to know. Yeah. So when it comes to logging them, if you're running in Windows App Fabric, whether it's Azure App Fabric or Windows Server App Fabric, then you get awesome logging, right? Because they have a monitoring database. All right, other questions? Yes, up here we have a question.
Hi, I have 2 questions. First of all, I'm wondering what are the differences between the State Machine CTP and what you're planning to ship, and also how will you handle in the dynamic update if the instance workflow doesn't actually correspond to something that you've updated? So, for example, in a state machine, if you have instances that are in a particular state, then you delete.
Right. Okay. So for the state machine, the first part of the question is, will it change? Yes, it will change. Has already changed. I don't have a specific list of the kind of changes. As far as I can tell, they're minor things. But if you have some state machine XAML files that you've saved under the CTP, I suspect if we tried to load those up, we'd probably see some errors that are probably fixable, I'm sure, easily. But now, on the second part about the dynamic update and what if there's a missing activity? So, Leon, why don't you shoot up here and tell me about that? Because this is Leon's feature. So he has all the inside information about what happens if we delete a state. So come on out here, Leon, and tell me what would happen. So if we had a state machine, we persisted, we deleted one of the states, and then we gave the update map, and the thing was in that state, what would happen?
In that case, you would not be able to. You cannot update running. You cannot change activities that are in a running state. I mean, if one thing that you can do is you can disable update inside of some activities. So is that the question, or
no? So okay. So there's what he was saying was, when you create your update map, there's a little checkbox you can say, if an activity is running on this one, don't update it. Or well, actually, it means just don't ever update this activity.
Yeah, exactly. That instance.
And then what you were saying, the other thing you said is, if we happen to, remember I said the instance state has an instruction pointer. So if the instruction pointer is pointing at a thing, we can't update that, right?
Yep.
So we're going to throw an exception.
Yes.
Okay? All right. With 20 seconds left, I'm probably going to have to take the rest of the questions out in the hall. Thank you guys for coming.